Don't embarrass me by holding my hand. She told me one afternoon as we walked down a crowded street, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise of traffic. I thought it was just a slip, an awkward moment she'd laugh about later, but I didn't know then that those 7 words would set the stage for everything that came after. If she didn't want me holding her hand, fine, I could stop. But the truth was, when I stopped holding her hand, I also stopped holding on to everything else that made us who we were. This is the story of how love went from warmth and closeness to cold distance, and how one line made me realize that sometimes letting go is the only choice left. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Daniel, and if you had asked anyone who knew me just a few years ago, they would have said I was the kind of man who gave everything to the people I loved. I grew up in a small town, the kind where you couldn't go anywhere without running into someone you knew. Family and loyalty were drilled into me early, and I carried those values into adulthood. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't rich, but I believed in showing affection, in small gestures that reminded the people in my life that they mattered. Holding hands was one of those things. To me, it wasn't just about the physical act. It was about connection, reassurance, and a kind of unspoken bond that said, I'm here, with you, no matter what. That's why when my girlfriend at the time, Marissa, flinched at my touch in public, it didn't just sting, it shattered something I hadn't realized was fragile. To be clear, when we first started dating, she wasn't like that. Marissa was vibrant, outgoing, and playful. We met at a friend's birthday dinner in the city. She had this infectious laugh that carried across the room, the kind that made everyone else turn their heads and smile without even knowing what was funny. I was drawn to her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, with these expressive hazel eyes that always looked like they were holding back a secret. No, what got me was how alive she seemed. She told me she wanted to travel the world, to try things that scared her, to live big and loud. Next to her, I felt like the quieter half, but I liked that. She pulled me out of my comfort zone, made me want to do more, be more. In the early days, holding hands was something she initiated. She'd reach for me across a restaurant table, intertwine her fingers with mine when we crossed the street, and even in those moments when we'd sit side by side on her couch watching some random Netflix series, she'd absent-mindedly lace her hand into mine like it was second nature. Back then, she seemed proud to show me off, to let the world know we were together. And I remember thinking how lucky I was, because it felt so natural, like maybe I'd finally found someone who saw affection the way I did, not as something silly, but as something essential. But as time passed, things changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. At first, it was her pulling her hand back a little sooner when we were walking. Then it was her saying she felt too hot or too sweaty to hold hands. I brushed it off. I didn't want to be the clingy boyfriend who read too much into tiny things. But that day, when she told me not to embarrass her by holding her hand, it was different. There was no excuse, no softening of the blow. Just a flat rejection, almost like she was ashamed to be seen with me in that way. I can still remember the heat in my chest when she said it, the way my fingers curled into fists at my sides, not out of anger but out of a sudden emptiness. I let my hand fall back, shoved it into my pocket, and tried to play it off like it didn't matter. But inside, it mattered more than I wanted to admit. That sentence stuck in my head like an echo, and as we kept walking, it was all I could hear. Looking back now, I realized that moment was the first crack in the foundation of what we had built. It wasn't about holding hands at all. It was about the way she saw me, the way she valued, or didn't value, our connection. It was about how something that once came so naturally now felt like an inconvenience, an embarrassment. And though I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just a bad day, the truth was, a shift had already begun. That's what I want to share in this story, the journey from that single sentence to the unraveling of everything else. Because sometimes, the smallest moments carry the heaviest weight. Sometimes, one simple rejection can make you question everything you thought was solid, everything you thought was love. Before that moment on the street, before her words cut me deeper than I let on, my life with Marissa had a different rhythm, one that seemed almost picture-perfect from the outside. We met in our mid-20s, at a time when both of us were trying to figure out who we were supposed to be in the world. I was working as an assistant manager at a small logistics firm, the kind of job that kept me busy but not exactly fulfilled, while she had just started climbing the ladder at a marketing agency. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. My days were spent with spreadsheets, warehouse schedules, and endless meetings about delivery timelines, while hers were filled with brainstorm sessions, flashy presentations, and late-night networking events in downtown lounges. Despite our differences, something clicked between us. She said she liked that I was grounded, that I wasn't like the other guys she met who always tried too hard to impress. And I liked her energy, the way she lit up every room she entered. When we first started dating, I introduced her to my world slowly. I took her back to the small town I grew up in, where my parents still lived in the same two-story house with the peeling white paint and the rose bushes out front that my mom cared for religiously. She met my father, a quiet man who measured people by the strength of their handshake, and my mother, who had a way of making anyone feel like family within 5 minutes of meeting them. To my relief, Marissa charmed them both. She laughed at my dad's dry jokes, complimented my mom's cooking, and even helped my younger cousin with her college application essays one weekend we visited. My family adored her, and I remember thinking that it was a sign that maybe this was the woman I could build something lasting with. In her world, things looked very different. The first time I went to one of her work functions, I felt like a fish out of water. The bar was sleek and modern, the kind of place where the cheapest drink cost more than what I usually spent on an entire dinner. Her co-workers were polished, dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, and they carried themselves with a confidence that made me feel invisible. But Marissa didn't seem to notice my discomfort. She held on to me then, proudly introducing me as her boyfriend, and I remember feeling a surge of pride despite my awkwardness. For a while, I believed we balanced each other out. I brought her stability, and she pulled me into experiences I never would have had on my own. Our early months were full of those contrasts. She'd drag me to rooftop bars and art galleries, while I'd convince her to come along on camping trips or Sunday morning hikes. We found a middle ground in quiet nights at her apartment, cooking together or just sprawled on her living room floor with a bottle of wine and a playlist of whatever music she was into that week. Back then, she was affectionate without hesitation. She'd lean into me on crowded subway rides, reach for my hand without thinking twice, and tell me she loved how safe she felt with me. Those words mattered to me, maybe more than I let on, because I'd always been the kind of person who believed relationships were about that, about safety, about knowing you had someone who wouldn't let go even when things got hard. I carried those beliefs into every little thing I did for her. If her day was rough, I'd show up with her favorite takeout. When she mentioned in passing that she missed the smell of her grandmother's cookies, I secretly called her mother to get the recipe and spent a weekend learning to bake them. I thought love was built in those details, in remembering the small things and turning them into gestures that said, "I see you, I hear you, you matter to me." For a while I thought she understood that too. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as the months turned into years, the differences between our worlds started to feel less like balance and more like friction. My steady job, which once seemed reliable and responsible, began to look dull next to her rapid promotions and shiny career milestones. She started talking more about the people she met at work, their trips abroad, their designer wardrobes, their ambitious projects. I was proud of her, truly, but I also started to feel like maybe I wasn't enough. The gap between us wasn't just about money or status. It was about how we saw ourselves, and slowly, how we saw each other. Still, I clung to the belief that love could bridge that gap. I kept showing up, kept trying to prove my worth in the only ways I knew how. I believed in us because I had seen the version of her that once looked at me like I was exactly what she needed. I told myself that if I just held on tight enough, if I just kept giving, we'd find our way back to that place. And maybe that's why her words on that street hit me so hard. It wasn't just about holding hands. It was about all the ways she had begun to pull back, to create distance where there once was closeness. Before that, though, our life together had moments that felt almost like a dream. We planned trips, celebrated birthdays with friends, talked about maybe getting a dog one day. She even brought up the idea of moving in together, something that made me both nervous and excited. I thought those conversations meant we were serious, that we were building something real. My friends told me how lucky I was, and even when I sometimes wondered if we were too different, I always shut those doubts down with the memory of her smile, the way she used to lace her fingers with mine without hesitation. I didn't know then that the very thing that once made us feel inseparable, the balance of our differences, would eventually become the wedge that pushed us apart. All I knew in those early days was that I loved her, and that was enough to make me believe we could survive anything. When I think back to how it all started, I can still picture the exact night our paths crossed, and how unlikely it all seemed at the time. It was a Saturday evening in late spring, one of those rare nights when the city felt alive but not suffocating, where the streets buzzed with energy without tipping into chaos. A mutual friend, Eric, had invited me to a birthday dinner at a modern Italian place downtown, and I almost didn't go. I'd been exhausted from the week, buried in logistics reports and a mountain of emails, and the thought of squeezing into a crowded restaurant full of people I barely knew didn't feel appealing. But something in me said I should push myself to go. I didn't know it then, but if I'd stayed home, my life would have taken a very different turn. When I walked into the restaurant, the air was filled with the smell of wood-fired pizza and expensive cologne. People were gathered around a long table in the back, glasses clinking, conversations flowing. That's when I noticed her, Marissa, sitting near the middle, laughing at something Eric had said. Her laugh wasn't forced or polite, it was real, the kind that carried across the room and made you want to know the story behind it. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and she wore a deep green dress that stood out against the muted tones everyone else seemed to favor. I remember thinking she didn't just walk into the room, she owned it. I ended up sitting 2 seats away from her, close enough to hear snippets of her conversation, but not close enough to be part of it. I listened as she told a story about a disastrous presentation at work, how the projector froze on the wrong slide, and how she'd somehow managed to spin the entire situation into a joke that won her client over. The way she spoke, animated and confident, made it impossible not to notice her. Later in the evening, when the group shifted around to mingle, Eric introduced us casually. "This is Marissa," he said. "She just started working at Westbridge Marketing." She extended her hand, firm grip, steady gaze, and said, "Nice to meet you, Daniel." Simple, but something about the way she looked at me made me feel seen. We ended up talking for most of the night. At first, it was surface-level stuff, jobs, hobbies, favorite foods, but as the wine flowed, the conversation deepened. She told me about how she'd grown up in the suburbs, about her parents, messy divorce when she was in high school, about how she'd promised herself she'd build a life big enough to never feel small again. I shared a little about my own background, about my small-town upbringing, and how I was trying to figure out what success meant for me. At one point, she leaned in and said, "You're different from most of the guys I meet in the city. You actually listen." It was such a small comment, but it stuck with me. By the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers, and as I walked her out to her rideshare, she touched my arm lightly and said, "Text me tomorrow." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. That confidence, that certainty drew me in even more. The next day, true to her words, she texted me first. "Coffee later?" That became our first official date. We met at a quiet cafe near her apartment, a little hole-in-the-wall spot that served strong espresso and homemade pastries. I arrived a few minutes early, nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. When she walked in, wearing a simple white blouse and jeans, I realized how effortless her presence was. We talked for hours, so long that the barista had to politely tell us they were closing. When we finally left, she slipped her hand into mine without hesitation as we walked down the street. That gesture, it felt like the start of something real, something meaningful. The weeks that followed were filled with that same kind of magic. She had a way of making ordinary things feel extraordinary. A walk in the park became an adventure because she'd stop to point out the way the light filtered through the trees, or how the ducks squabbled for crumbs like little kids fighting over candy. A late-night trip to the grocery store turned into laughter-filled chaos as she piled random snacks into the cart, daring me to try things I'd never eaten before. She was spontaneous in a way that contrasted with my careful, structured personality, and I found myself wanting to loosen up around her, to match her energy. She seemed equally taken with me, at least in those early days. She'd tell me she loved how calm I was, how I didn't get rattled by small inconveniences. She once said, "You're like an anchor, Daniel. You make me feel steady." That meant everything to me, because I wanted to be that for her. to be the person she could rely on when the world felt unstable. Looking back, I can see the small warning signs, even in those first months. She talked often about appearances, about how people at her job cared about image and presentation more than substance. She'd joke about not wanting to be seen with someone who didn't fit the part at certain events, though she always followed it up with, "But you're different. You have your own kind of charm." At the time, I laughed it off, thinking she was just poking fun at the superficial world she worked in. I didn't realize those words held more weight than I wanted to admit. Still, in those beginning months, it felt like we were unstoppable. Every weekend was an adventure, exploring new neighborhoods, trying trendy restaurants, going on spontaneous road trips just because she wanted to chase the horizon. My friends noticed how happy I was, how much lighter I seemed, and even though part of me worried that we were moving fast, I convinced myself that love was supposed to feel like this: exciting, overwhelming, bigger than logic. I held onto that feeling tightly, convinced it was the foundation of something lasting. I didn't know then that beginnings, no matter how bright, can sometimes blind you to what lies beneath the surface. All I knew was that I was falling, and I believed she was falling with me. The months that followed felt like something out of a dream, the kind of stretch in life where you forget about the possibility of endings because the present feels so certain, so solid. With Marissa, everything seemed brighter, sharper, more alive. She had a way of pulling me into her world and making me believe I belonged there, even when I doubted myself. Those early good times with her became etched into my memory as the proof that love could transform the ordinary into something extraordinary. One of my favorite memories from that period was the first trip we took together. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a weekend getaway to a lakeside cabin a few hours outside the city, but it felt like a world apart from everything we were used to. I remember the drive, windows down, music blasting from a playlist we'd made together. She sang along, off-key and unashamed, and I laughed so hard when she tried to harmonize with the chorus of a song she barely knew. When we arrived, the air was crisp with pine, and the water reflected the sky like glass. We spent the weekend hiking trails, cooking simple meals, and lying on the dock at night staring at the stars. She reached for my hand often then, her fingers lacing through mine as if it was the most natural thing in the world. At one point, she turned to me and said, "Can you believe how lucky we are? This feels perfect." And in that moment, I truly believed it. Back in the city, we built a rhythm together that made even the small things feel special. Sunday mornings became sacred, reserved for slow breakfasts in her apartment. She'd make pancakes while I brewed the coffee, and we'd sit on her tiny balcony, watching the city wake up around us. Those mornings were filled with laughter, inside jokes, and the kind of comfortable silence that only comes when you feel completely at ease with someone. I remember one morning she leaned across the table, maple syrup smeared on her lip, and said, "Promise me we'll never get boring." I promised without hesitation, because at that time, the idea of us ever being dull felt impossible. She also loved introducing me to new experiences. One evening, she surprised me with tickets to a jazz club. I'd never been to one before, and the idea of spending hours listening to music I didn't know much about didn't thrill me at first. But when we walked into that dimly lit room, filled with the sound of saxophones and the murmur of people sipping wine, I saw her eyes light up in a way that made me fall for her all over again. She swayed to the music, pulled me onto the tiny dance floor, and whispered, "Just follow my lead." I did, clumsily at first, but soon I found myself moving with her, caught up in the moment. Later that night, as we walked back to her place, she slipped her hand into mine and said, "See? I told you I'd teach you how to love life louder." I smiled because she was right. She was teaching me things I didn't even know I wanted to learn. We also had our share of cozy nights in, moments that didn't require the city's distractions. One Friday, after a particularly long week, we ordered cheap pizza, curled up on her couch, and watched a marathon of old movies. She fell asleep halfway through, her head on my chest, and I remember staring down at her, overwhelmed by the quiet certainty that I could spend the rest of my life like this. Those were the moments that sealed it for me. Not the big adventures, but the simple ones. I didn't need anything flashy, just her beside me. My family noticed how happy I was. When I brought her home again for Thanksgiving, my mom pulled me aside in the kitchen and whispered, "She's good for you, Daniel. I can see it." My dad, not a man of many words, gave me a nod of approval after dinner, which was as close as he ever came to saying he was proud. Even my friends teased me about how much I lit up when I talked about her, how I'd become the guy who couldn't stop smiling at his phone because she'd sent some random text that made me laugh. Marissa seemed just as invested. She would talk about our future like it was already written, weekend trips we hadn't taken yet, concerts she wanted us to go to, even hypothetical conversations about where we might live if we got more serious. She once said, "I can see us building something amazing together. You're the kind of person who makes me want to stay grounded, even when I'm flying too high." Hearing her say that filled me with pride, like I was her safe place, the anchor she'd once told me I was. Looking back, I realized that period was the peak of what we had, the height of our connection, when I believed we were unstoppable. Everything seemed to fall into place so easily, so naturally, that I stopped questioning the differences between us. I didn't notice the subtle shifts, the small cracks forming under the surface. I was blinded by the warmth of those good times, convinced that they were proof we could weather anything. If I had known what was coming, maybe I would have paid more attention to the fleeting moments when her eyes lingered elsewhere, or the times she seemed distracted even when she was smiling. But in those days I didn't look for warning signs. I didn't want to. I just wanted to hold on to the version of us that felt perfect, the version that made me believe love could truly conquer all. The first warning signs didn't come with fireworks or dramatic fights. They slipped in quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like shadows creeping into a room where the lights had been so bright before. It's strange how you can look back and see the pattern so clearly, but when you're in it, those moments feel like nothing more than small annoyances, the kind of things you convince yourself every couple goes through. But the truth is, those little things were the beginning of everything unraveling. It started with her phone. In the early days, Marissa had been open, leaving her phone on the table face up, laughing as she showed me memes her friends sent or scrolling through photos together. But gradually, she became more protective of it. She started keeping it face down, and if a message came in while we were together, she'd quickly flip it over or tuck it into her bag. When I asked about it, she brushed it off with a casual, "Work stuff, nothing interesting." I didn't push because I didn't want to seem insecure, but a small unease settled in the back of my mind. Then came the change in her availability. She used to text me throughout the day, even if it was just a quick "thinking of you" or a funny gif to make me laugh. But as her job picked up pace, the messages grew fewer and farther between. At first, I understood. She had big projects and demanding clients. But eventually, the silence stretched longer than it used to. And when I'd finally hear from her, her replies felt rushed, like she was distracted. When I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd sigh and say, "You worry too much, Daniel. Not everything is about us." The way she said it stung, even though I tried to tell myself she didn't mean it harshly. Our weekends, once sacred, also started shifting. She used to block out time for us. Late-night dinners, lazy Sundays, spontaneous road trips. But slowly, other things began to take priority. Work events, new social circles, brunches with coworkers I'd never met. "You could come with me," she'd sometimes say, but it always sounded more like an obligation than an invitation. When I did go, I often felt like the odd one out, standing in the corner while she floated from group to group, laughing, telling stories, making sure everyone noticed her. I'd smile and nod, but inside, I felt invisible. The first time I really noticed something was off was at a friend's party. It was a rooftop gathering, casual, with music, drinks, and fairy lights strung along the railings. We'd been having a good time, or at least I thought we had, until I instinctively reached for her hand. She stiffened, just slightly, and pulled back. When I glanced at her, she gave me a tight smile and whispered, "Not now, Daniel." It was such a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to me, it felt like a punch to the gut. That was the first time I realized she didn't want the world to see us the way I did. After that, the excuses piled up. She'd say she was tired, that she needed space, that I was too affectionate in public. I tried to adapt, telling myself that not everyone showed love the same way, that maybe I was asking for too much. But every time she pulled her hand away, or leaned back when I tried to kiss her in front of others, a little piece of me chipped away. I started to wonder if I was embarrassing her somehow, if being with me wasn't something she wanted people to notice. Another warning sign came in the form of her comments. Small, cutting remarks disguised as jokes. She'd tease me about my job, calling it predictable compared to the fast-paced world she lived in. She once laughed and said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm dating someone twice my age, just because I preferred quiet nights and over constant socializing." I laughed with her at the time, but later, lying in bed alone, those words replayed in my head, leaving me with a sinking feeling I couldn't shake. There were also moments when she seemed almost restless with me. During conversations, I'd catch her eyes drifting to her phone or scanning the room if we were out. When I told her about something at work, something I was proud of, she'd nod absent-mindedly and change the subject back to her latest project or her colleagues. I wanted to be supportive of her, and I was. I celebrated every promotion, every success, but I couldn't help noticing that the same enthusiasm didn't flow back toward me. It was like my world mattered less, like I was shrinking in her eyes while she kept expanding in mine. The first time I brought it up seriously, we were sitting in her apartment after dinner. I told her I felt like she was pulling away, that I missed how things used to be between us. She sighed, exasperated, and said, "Daniel, you're overthinking everything. Not every relationship stays in the honeymoon phase forever. We're just getting comfortable, that's all." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. Because it didn't feel like comfort, it felt like dismissal. The truth is, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that what we had was still strong, that these small shifts were normal. I clung to that hope, convincing myself that love wasn't supposed to be easy all the time, that couples went through ups and downs. But deep down, a quiet voice kept whispering that something was different, that something had changed. I ignored that voice because I didn't want to face what it might mean. Instead, I held on tighter, hoping that if I just loved her enough, she'd find her way back to me. But what I didn't realize then was that love isn't something you can hold on to alone. And the more I ignored the warning signs, the harder it would be when the truth finally came crashing down. As the months went on, what had once been subtle unease between Marissa and me began to swell into something heavier, undeniable, and suffocating. The cracks that I had tried to ignore in the beginning widened into gaps I couldn't bridge, no matter how hard I tried. At first, I told myself relationships went through phases, that we were just adjusting to new challenges in our lives. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was a shift not only in her behavior but in the very atmosphere between us. Like the warmth we once shared had been drained and replaced by something cold, distant, and unwelcoming. One of the first big changes came in the way we fought. Early on, we hardly ever argued, and if we did, it was over something trivial, a forgotten text, a minor misunderstanding that we resolved quickly. But now, every small disagreement seemed to ignite into something larger. It was as though the patience she once had for me evaporated. If I asked her when she'd be home, she snapped that I was interrogating her. If I suggested we spend the weekend together, she rolled her eyes and told me I was being clingy. The more I tried to reach out, the more she recoiled, until even ordinary conversations felt like walking through a minefield. I remember one night in particular, when I brought up how distant she seemed. We were sitting in her living room, the TV playing faintly in the background, when I finally asked, "Do you even want to be with me anymore?" She stared at me like I had just asked the most ridiculous question in the world and said, "You're being dramatic. Not everything has to be so serious, Daniel." But her tone was flat, her eyes distant, and it felt like she wasn't talking to me at all, just brushing me off so she wouldn't have to confront the truth. Her public behavior toward me also shifted in ways that cut deeper than any argument. The rooftop incident where she pulled her hand away had been painful, but it was only the beginning. As time went on, she became bolder in her dismissal. At a dinner with her colleagues, I tried once more to hold her hand under the table, only for her to withdraw so quickly it was as if my touch burned her. When I gave her a questioning look, she muttered, "Not here, Daniel, please." That word, please, wasn't tender, but sharp, like I was doing something offensive. The rest of the night, I sat stiffly, trying to smile at conversations, but I couldn't shake the shame that coiled in my chest. Even around our mutual friends, she treated me differently. There was a gathering at Ethan's apartment, where we had both been invited. While we used to stick close, sharing inside jokes and laughing together, that night she floated around like she didn't even know me. She spoke animatedly with others, her hand brushing someone's arm as she laughed, while I stood off to the side, a drink in my hand, waiting for her to acknowledge me. When she finally did, it was only to say, "Daniel, can you grab me another soda?" Like I was an errand boy rather than her partner. Our friends exchanged awkward glances, but no one said anything, and I forced a smile, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. At home, the intimacy we once shared dwindled until it felt like we were strangers living parallel lives. She stopped leaning into me on the couch. She stopped greeting me with hugs. Even in bed, she would turn away, scrolling on her phone late into the night while I lay awake beside her, wondering what had gone wrong. When I tried to initiate closeness, she pushed me off with excuses. She was tired, she had a headache, she had to wake up early. After enough rejections, I stopped trying, because the sting of being unwanted was worse than the loneliness itself. The most telling sign, though, was her growing resentment toward my efforts to fix things. Whenever I suggested we talk, she accused me of making everything into a problem. When I proposed counseling, she laughed bitterly and asked, "Are we really that broken to you?" It was like she saw my concern not as love, but as an inconvenience. The harder I tried, the more she resented me for it, until I began to feel like my very presence annoyed her. The escalation wasn't only emotional, it seeped into the practical aspects of our lives too. She stopped inviting me to events, stopped asking for my input on her decisions, and began operating as though she were single. She made plans without telling me, often disappearing for hours or entire evenings with vague explanations about work friends. When I asked who she was with, she bristled, accusing me of being controlling. It was a clever deflection, because it made me feel guilty for even questioning her, even though any reasonable partner would have wanted reassurance. I noticed her appearance changing as well. She had always been stylish, but lately she dressed with a sharpness and precision she hadn't before, especially when going out without me. New clothes, fresh hairstyles, expensive makeup. When I complimented her, she smiled absently, but when others noticed, she lit up. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't dressing for me anymore, but for someone, or something else. The breaking point of this stage came one evening when we were supposed to meet for dinner. I had made reservations at her favorite restaurant, thinking it might help us reconnect. She showed up 45 minutes late, her phone in hand, barely apologetic. I tried to start a conversation, telling her about my day, but she interrupted, saying, "Can we not do this right now? I just want to eat and go home." It was the coldness in her tone that shattered me, more than the words themselves. That night, as I sat across from her, I realized we weren't just drifting apart, we were already far from each other, and I was the only one still trying to swim back. The problems weren't subtle anymore. They were loud, glaring, impossible to ignore. Our relationship was no longer slipping through my fingers. It had already slipped. But because I still loved her, I wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, I told myself I could endure, that I could hold on a little longer. I didn't know then that the real storm hadn't even begun. The more Marissa pulled away, the more isolated I began to feel, as if I was carrying the weight of our crumbling relationship entirely on my shoulders. I tried convincing myself that if I was patient, if I was steady, she would eventually see the value of what we had and return to the person I had fallen for. But there was a point when I realized that I couldn't trust my own perception anymore. I had become so tangled in my love for her and my fear of losing her that I didn't know if I was being overly dramatic or if she was truly treating me unfairly. That was when I finally started opening up to others about what I had been experiencing, desperate for some kind of anchor outside of my own spinning thoughts. The first person I confided in was my sister Claire. She had always been blunt with me, sometimes to the point of annoyance, but she was also the person I trusted most to give me an honest perspective. One night, after another cold exchange with Marissa that left me hollow, I called Claire and asked if she wanted to grab coffee. We sat in a small cafe downtown, the smell of espresso heavy in the air, as I tried to explain what had been going on. I told her about the rooftop incident, about Marissa pulling her hand away, and how that behavior had only gotten worse. I told her how arguments seemed to erupt out of nothing, how I felt like a nuisance rather than a partner, and how every attempt to bring us back together seemed to push her further away. Claire listened carefully, her brow furrowed, and when I was done, she didn't sugarcoat her response. "Daniel, I love you, but this doesn't sound like a healthy relationship. It sounds like you're bending over backwards for someone who doesn't even want to meet you halfway. You deserve to be loved openly, not hidden away." Her words hit me like a splash of cold water. I wanted to argue, to defend Marissa, but when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. Deep down, I knew she was right. A week later, I ended up talking to my closest friend, Marcus. He had known Marissa almost as long as I had, and I thought maybe he could help me understand her side better. We met at a bar after work, the kind of place where the dim lighting made it easier to have conversations that mattered. I didn't intend to spill everything, but after a few drinks, the frustration I had been bottling up came pouring out. I told him how humiliated I felt at dinners and parties, how she dismissed me in public, and how intimacy had all but disappeared between us. Marcus leaned back, swirling the ice in his glass, and sighed. "Man, I've noticed some of this too. The way she talks to you sometimes. It's not okay." I didn't want to say anything because I figured maybe that's just how you two are with each other, but honestly, it looks bad from the outside. Like she's embarrassed by you or something. And if that's how it seems to your friends, imagine how it looks to strangers. He shook his head, and his words settled in my chest with a heavy weight. Hearing it from Claire was one thing, but hearing it from Marcus, who had witnessed the dynamic firsthand, made it undeniable. Even my parents, who rarely interfered in my relationship, started to notice. During a Sunday dinner at their house, Marissa declined to join me, saying she had too much to do, though she never explained what. As we ate, my mother gently asked, "Is everything okay between you two?" I hesitated, not wanting to admit weakness, but eventually I confessed that things hadn't been great. My father, who usually kept his thoughts to himself, said quietly, "Respect goes both ways, Daniel. If it feels one-sided, it probably is." It wasn't a lecture, just a simple observation, but it echoed in my mind long after the plates had been cleared. The most unexpected validation came from someone I barely knew, a coworker named Olivia. One afternoon at work, she caught me staring blankly at my computer screen and asked if I was all right. I brushed it off at first, but she pressed, and I admitted that things at home weren't great. I kept it vague, but when I mentioned how Marissa often made me feel small in public, Olivia frowned. "I've seen you two together once or twice, and I don't want to overstep, but she didn't seem very kind to you. It actually stood out to me. You seem like a good guy, Daniel. You don't deserve that." Coming from someone outside my circle, her words cut deep in a different way. They weren't clouded by loyalty or personal bias. They were just an honest observation from the outside looking in, and it confirmed what I had been too afraid to admit. Marissa's treatment of me wasn't hidden. It was obvious to others too. The accumulation of these conversations began to shift something inside me. I realized I had been gaslighting myself, convincing myself that I was the problem, that I was too sensitive, too demanding. But hearing from the people who cared about me, and even those who barely knew me, made it clear that the problem wasn't just in my head. I wasn't imagining the coldness, the dismissiveness, the humiliation. It was real, and others saw it too. Yet even with all that validation, I wasn't ready to let go. Love has a strange way of blinding us to truths we'd never tolerate otherwise. I clung to the memories of the good times, to the promises Marissa had once made, and told myself that maybe, just maybe, if I held on long enough, things would turn around. But in my heart, I knew something had shifted permanently. The Marissa who used to laugh with me on Sunday mornings and dream about our future together wasn't the same woman who now rolled her eyes when I tried to hold her hand. The voices of my sister, my friends, my parents, and even a near stranger echoed in my head, reminding me that love shouldn't feel like humiliation, that I wasn't crazy for wanting the simple dignity of being cared for openly. I just didn't know yet how to translate that realization into action. I was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the truth, but I hadn't found the strength to jump. The realization didn't come as one sharp moment, but rather as a slow and painful unraveling, though there was a particular night when the weight of everything finally broke me. For weeks, I had been clinging to a version of Marissa that no longer existed, convincing myself that if I just tried a little harder, if I just gave her more space, if I just stopped being so sensitive, things would return to the way they were. But deep down, I was running out of excuses, and the truth was catching up with me faster than I wanted to admit. It was on a Friday evening when we had agreed, at least I thought we had agreed, to have dinner together. I had left work early, stopped by the store to buy ingredients for one of her favorite dishes, and even picked up a bottle of wine I knew she liked. I wanted to create one of those rare nights that might remind us of the good times, something that could bridge the growing distance. I cooked while waiting for her, setting the table carefully, even lighting a couple of candles because I thought maybe the small gestures still mattered. But when 8 o'clock passed and she hadn't arrived, my calls went unanswered. By 9, the food sat cold on the table, and I was pacing the living room, trying not to imagine where she might be or who she might be with. It wasn't until close to 11 that she finally walked through the door, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, her hair styled as though she had been out somewhere far more exciting than where I had been waiting. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice trembling, not from anger but from the exhaustion of carrying so much doubt alone. She didn't even bother to look apologetic. "Out," she said simply, tossing her bag onto the couch. "Don't start with me tonight, Daniel. I'm not in the mood." I stared at her, at the indifference in her tone, and something inside me cracked. For months, I had been twisting myself into knots trying to hold us together, trying to convince myself that her coldness was temporary, that her distance had an explanation. But that night, standing in our apartment with the uneaten meal behind me and her dismissive gaze in front of me, I finally saw it clearly. She didn't care anymore. Not about me, not about us, not about the life we had once promised each other. The rest of the night was a blur of arguments and silences. I asked her point blank if she still loved me, and she avoided the question, shrugging it off with, "Why do you always need to label everything? Why can't you just let things be?" That was the moment I realized that her silence was my answer. Love doesn't dodge. Love doesn't diminish someone to the point of invisibility. Love doesn't humiliate you for wanting to be held. I barely slept that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of her steady breathing beside me like a cruel reminder that we were lying in the same bed but living in different worlds. My chest ached with the weight of months of rejection, humiliation, and longing. I replayed every warning sign, every red flag, every dismissive comment that I had brushed aside, and I felt the sharp sting of regret for not walking away sooner. The next morning, I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the city move below me, and I felt hollow. My sister's words came back to me. "You deserve to be loved openly, not hidden away." Marcus's observation echoed too. "It looks like she's embarrassed by you." Even Olivia's offhand comment, "She didn't seem very kind to you," pierced through the fog. Everyone else had seen it long before I allowed myself to. And that was the hardest truth to swallow. I hadn't just lost Marissa, I had lost myself in the process of trying to keep her. Later that week, the final straw came when she canceled on me yet again. We were supposed to attend a friend's engagement party together, something we had RSVP'd for months before, and at the last minute she told me she wasn't feeling up to it. When I pressed, she admitted she had other plans. She didn't even try to soften the blow. She said it casually, as if my disappointment didn't matter. And for the first time, I didn't cry or plead or try to argue. I just sat there, numb, realizing that I had become invisible in my own relationship. That night, I went to the party alone, and the looks of pity from people who noticed her absence felt unbearable. A friend I hadn't spoken to in years pulled me aside and asked, "Are you okay? You don't look happy, Daniel." I wanted to say something, to defend her, to defend us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I excused myself, walked outside into the cool night air, and for the first time allowed myself to admit it. We were over. Not officially, not yet, but emotionally, spiritually, everything that had once bound us together had unraveled. I was clinging to a ghost. When I got home that night, I found her asleep in bed, her phone buzzing on the nightstand with messages she hadn't bothered to hide. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. The truth was written all over her indifference. As I stood there watching her sleep, I realized that I had already hit rock bottom. This was it. There was no fixing, no waiting, no hoping for the person she once was to return. The version of her I loved no longer existed, and the version who remained didn't love me back. In that moment, the denial that had been holding me captive for so long finally shattered. My love for her hadn't been enough to save us, and maybe it was never supposed to be. The pain of that realization was sharp, but beneath it, there was something else too, a strange clarity, a quiet voice that whispered, "You can't live like this anymore." That was the night I decided I couldn't keep holding on. I hadn't figured out what I was going to do next, or how I was going to do it. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep sacrificing my dignity, my peace, and my self-worth for someone who treated me like an embarrassment. It was time to stop begging for scraps of affection and start demanding more from life, even if that meant walking away. The morning after my breaking point, I woke with a strange sense of calm, like the storm inside me had finally exhausted itself. For months, I had been waking to a knot in my chest, anxiety gnawing at me before the day had even begun, but that day it felt different. I knew what I had to do. There was no grand epiphany, no dramatic movie moment, just a quiet certainty that I couldn't keep living like this. Marissa and I were finished, even if the words hadn't been spoken yet. The thought terrified me, but it also gave me a flicker of strength I hadn't felt in a long time. I waited until she woke up, and when she finally rolled over, groggy and uninterested, I said, "We need to talk." Her sigh told me everything about where we stood. "Daniel, not this again," she muttered, reaching for her phone. But I didn't back down this time. I told her plainly that I couldn't do it anymore, that I couldn't keep begging for affection or pretending we were still in love when she treated me like an obligation. For the first time I spoke without pleading, without hoping she would suddenly soften. I spoke for myself, not for her. At first, she tried to dismiss me, saying I was being too sensitive, that I was blowing things out of proportion. Then, when she realized I was serious, she grew angry. "So you're just going to give up? After everything?" Her words might have hurt once, but in that moment, I saw them for what they were, a deflection, an attempt to shift the blame. I told her calmly that I wasn't giving up. I was choosing myself for once. Her face twisted with frustration, but she didn't argue further. In her silence, I found the confirmation I needed. She hadn't been fighting for us, and now she wouldn't fight against the end either. The days that followed were painful but oddly liberating. I packed my things slowly, each box a reminder of the life we had tried to build together. The first few nights in my new apartment were difficult. I lay awake surrounded by silence, haunted by memories of her laugh, her touch, the good times that had once convinced me we were forever. But with each passing day, the silence became less oppressive and more peaceful. I began to see it not as emptiness, but as space. Space to breathe, to heal, to rediscover who I was outside of her shadow. My support system rallied around me. Claire checked in daily, bringing over groceries or just sitting with me so I wouldn't feel alone. Marcus dragged me out for dinners and reminded me that there was life beyond heartbreak. Even Olivia, the coworker who had once voiced her concern, left a kind note on my desk that read, "You did the right thing. Don't forget that." Those small gestures mattered more than I could explain. They were proof that I wasn't invisible, that I mattered, and that I wasn't destined to live in the shame of being treated as less than. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were days when I still missed her, when I still questioned whether I had made the right choice. But then I would remember the way she recoiled from my hand, the way she dismissed my love, and the way she looked at me like I was a burden. Love shouldn't feel like humiliation. It should never make you shrink yourself to be tolerated. And in those moments of doubt, I reminded myself that leaving wasn't just the right choice. It was the only choice. Slowly, new beginnings began to take shape. I started going on runs again, something I had neglected during our relationship. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from, realizing how much of myself I had given up while trying to hold on to her. I even signed up for a photography class, something I had always wanted to try but never felt I had the time or energy for. Each step was small, but together they formed a path back to myself. One afternoon, a few weeks after the breakup, I found myself walking through the park alone. The air was crisp, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and for the first time in a long time I felt truly at peace. There was no hand to hold beside me, no laughter to share, but I didn't feel empty. I felt whole in a way I hadn't in months. I realized then that my happiness had never depended on Marissa. It had depended on me, on the choices I made to honor my worth and protect my peace. Reflecting on it all, I came to understand something important. Love is not about endurance. It's not about holding on no matter what, sacrificing your dignity in the process. Real love is about reciprocity, about being seen and valued, about two people choosing each other every day. What I had with Marissa may have started that way, but it hadn't stayed that way. And by clinging to the ghost of what we once were, I had almost lost myself entirely. If I could go back, I wouldn't change the fact that I loved her. That love taught me lessons I might not have learned otherwise. It showed me what I will never settle for again, and it reminded me that the truest form of love begins with self-respect, Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop holding on and instead let go. As I sit here now, months later, writing these words, I don't feel bitterness. I feel gratitude for the lessons, for the strength I didn't know I had, and for the clarity that came from finally choosing myself. If you find yourself in a situation like mine, I want you to know this. You are not an embarrassment, you are not invisible. And if someone makes you feel like you are, it's not because you're unworthy of love, it's because they don't know how to give it. Don't keep holding on to someone who won't even hold your hand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.